his forces were inflicting far more casualties than they actually were. And this was kind of an effort to keep the public eye in the Pacific as Allied command was placing its main focus in North Africa, because in 1942, what the U.S. decides is that they are going to have a Germany first policy, and the Pacific is going to kind of be on the back burner. And the reason for that is most of the U.S.'s allies, namely the British and the French, are more focused on the Nazis. France is obviously occupied by the Germans at the time. The British are constantly having to deal with bombardments of their major cities, and they're fighting the Germans in North Africa. And there is a need to relieve the Soviets. So MacArthur is going to put out these reports just to get the press to focus on him. He knows U.S. policy isn't going to shift to the Pacific until Germany's defeated. He's well aware of that. He's not in any kind of delusion about that. But he needs to keep the press on him for a number of reasons. He has political aspirations, which we'll talk about. There's rumors that he might want to be chief of staff again. His army career is far from over. He just wants to keep that public eye on him. But back to the Papua New Guinea campaign. So the next step, as I said, is for American forces and Australian forces to take the Japanese position at Buna, which was, like I said, heavily defended, and it was a near impossible task. So what Doug does is he goes to General Eichelberger of the 32nd Division under his command on Papua New Guinea, and basically says, hey, go take Buna or don't come back alive. Which, if you need motivation to do a near impossible task, Doug MacArthur coming to you and saying, hey, you're either going to do this and you're going to take this place, or you're not going to come back alive, that's more than enough motivation for anybody. So Eichelberger, follows his orders, and he actually he's successful against all odds. 32nd Infantry Division, supported by Australian units, ends up taking Buna from the Japanese. Following this, Doug actually declares a complete victory in New Guinea, which comes several weeks prior, before the Allies actually secure the entirety of the island. This was no doubt done in order to beat Admiral Bill Halsey, who was overseeing the Guadalcanal campaign at that point. MacArthur basically wanted to declare victory in New Guinea before Halsey could declare victory in Guadalcanal. Ironically enough, Halsey is going to become somewhat of a MacArthur ally later on. But Doug's rush to victory also resulted in a higher casualty rate for the Allies, because his subordinate commanders argued for more time to better plan the assault against Japanese positions. But like I said, MacArthur's going to rush it because he wants to basically have the spotlight on him. And as a result, it doesn't turn out too well for his subordinate commands. But regardless, the Allies end up taking it. The Japanese were on the verge of collapse due to starvation disease, so much so that if the Allies had waited, assaults could have gone smoother. Probably been less Allied death. But again, MacArthur just definitely did not want Halsey to declare victory in Guadalcanal before he could declare victory in Papua New Guinea. This also brings up another example of his egotistical kind of attitude, and this time it's General Eichelberger who's going to kind of face the brunt of Doug's wrath in kind of direct but also indirect kind of way. You see, after his success in New Guinea, there was a lot of consideration for Eichelberger to get the Medal of Honor for his successful campaign, basically being able to beat the Japanese against all odds. There was a big consideration for him to get the Medal of Honor. MacArthur basically says no. he has the final approval authority, being Eichelberger's, superior officer, the guy who's like directly above him. Mac would have had to sign off on it, and he kind of brushes it off, saying that he just did what he was supposed to do. He deserved some kind of commendation, but the Medal of Honor was too far. This probably happened due to the fact that Eichelberger had been getting a lot of good publicity for his actions on Buna, and Doug was basically just jealous of the attention, and he probably felt threatened to have him, his subordinate, all of a sudden become this kind of like media figure. And there was actually like rumors that he threatened Eichelberger with a demotion to colonel purely based on this fact. Luckily for him, it never happens, but he does get snubbed from getting his Medal of Honor, which, you could say one way or another if he actually deserved it for the campaign. More than likely, had Doug signed off on it, he probably would have got it. That award probably should have gone more so to the men actually on the beaches committing the actions. But regardless, it just serves as another kind of example of Mac's egotistical attitude and the wrath that he can impose on those subordinate to him who try to steal that spotlight, even if they're not actively trying to do that. Another example of Mac kind of inflating his numbers and trying to make himself look better for Washington is following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He gives his official report to General Marshall, and in that report, the stated numbers for Japanese casualties and Japanese destroyed vessels and equipment and all that kind of stuff, those numbers are way higher than they actually were. Now, in the beginning, it's not MacArthur's fault that these reports get filed the way they do. The reason that it happens is there was a lot of kind of duplicate reports that are made, and really what MacArthur did was he sent his report up to Marshall far sooner than he should have. There's usually a lot more care taken before that kind of stuff gets relayed to Washington, but Mac liked the numbers that he was seeing and hearing, so he wanted to send that off to Washington right away. Even after the reports confirmed a smaller, more believable number, Doug stood by the original reports, as did his Air Chief, General George Kenney. This is kind of another example or a good example of Kenney, who is going to have pretty good influence on MacArthur, kind of stroking that ego, kind of helping his own career along, but also making sure that Doug will be on his side when he needs him to be the most. Of course, it's not exactly, Kenney knew better. He probably more than likely knew that those numbers weren't correct. But the fact that he stood by Doug really kind of inflated Mac's ego more. And it actually caused an investigation which concluded Doug's initial report was wrong. Doug still refused to file an amended report even after Marshall requested one. And he actually dared Marshall to challenge his integrity if he didn't believe his report. And basically, General Marshall stands down. He's like, you know what? I don't really give a shit. This isn't worth my time. I've got a whole war in Europe, in Africa to deal with. I'm not going to fight with MacArthur over one report, over one kind of microcosm of the war. It's not going to be... I'm not going to waste any more time on this. This is just kind of another example of MacArthur going full egomaniac. It was also another episode of pissing off the Navy. In the process of recounting Bismarck, MacArthur decided to emphasize the use of ground-based air power as the main strategic weapon that basically led to victory, and claimed it was the most important piece in the support of the island-hopping campaign. This was done intentionally to piss off Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz. Mac practically said that the Navy was not of primary importance in a war that was taking place in the Pacific Ocean. It was also just flat out wrong. The amount of support that he got from naval air power during this campaign specifically was immense. While ground-based aircraft were, of course, important during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, you can't compare it to the amount of support that the Navy provided. And so this is just an example of him intentionally trying to overshadow the Navy, even if it was completely false. The whole fiasco was pointless and unnecessary on Mac's part because he simply could have rested on the fact that his forces had destroyed a major Japanese attempt to reinforce their position. He could have just said, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter if it was, the Navy, the Air Corps, the ground forces, whatever. They were all under my command. My forces were the ones who destroyed a major Japanese attempt to kind of counter our advance. The biggest positive improvement for Mac was his newfound respect for air power, though, which can't be understated. Obviously, he's overshadowing the Navy, but he's, emphasizing ground-based air power, which is, kind of a redemption for Doug after the fall of the Philippines and the collapse of his air force there, which was kind of his fault because he didn't order them to move at all. It had taken a lot of effort, mainly on the part of Kenny, to win Doug over to the idea that ground-based air power was a major factor in success on the ground. And because Kenny had stroked that ego just enough, he was able to win over Mac. And really, MacArthur owes a lot of his success, especially in this campaign, to George Kenny. But moving on, as I said earlier, Bill Halsey, naval commander, and was something of a rival to MacArthur. He was one of the guys leading the Guadalcanal campaign. In 1943, Halsey actually gets placed under MacArthur's command because his not a full fleet, but his naval forces basically get put in the area that MacArthur is in charge of. And this was followed after a meeting in Washington among Allied Pacific leaders and the Joint Chiefs. Halsey proved to be the only sailor who was able to break through MacArthur's prejudice about the Navy. As it's become clear, MacArthur, like I said, had no love of the Navy. He constantly fought with Admiral King and Admiral Nimitz and would make little slights at the Navy whenever the chance came. But Halsey's the one guy who's able to break through. The two developed a good relationship because Halsey was a fighter and Mac really respected it. Admiral Halsey had this nickname. His name was William Halsey, so it went by Bill, and by the end of the war he has a nickname called Bill Bull Halsey. He ends up becoming one of the only 5-star admirals the U.S. ever has, and he is a character for sure. If you've been following my Instagram page at all, you know that I've made a post about him, and I definitely want to do an episode on him someday because he's a character, and he's a really good naval commander. Mac's respect for Halsey was similar in spirit to that of George Kenny. If Kenny changed Mac's mind about air power, then Halsey changed it about naval power. The big difference between him and Kenny, though, is that Halsey never really strokes the ego of Mac. There's always going to be a small amount of strain in that relationship just because Halsey is a Navy man. But he's still able to overcome that and really convince Mac that naval power is really necessary. And already Mac is he doesn't want to admit it, but he's already used that to his advantage. One of the things that he becomes famous for in the Korean War is amphibious landings at Incheon, and then he attempted to recreate it at Wonsan. And the reason for that is because of the success that he had with the amphibious landings during this period of the war. And really that comes on the heels of something that Halsey introduced. See, Halsey had this subordinate named Admiral Barbie, who joined Mac's team as a result of this move. He was an amphibious landing kind of innovator, and his inclusion into Mac's team signaled success for future operations. Ironically, it was elements that Mac had shunned during his years of, chief of staff. He always thought amphibious warfare was, not something that was going to be any kind of major player. And really, when he was chief of staff, it wasn't too far out there to say that, because amphibious landings up until that point through the modern era hadn't been very successful. The most significant amphibious landing up until that point was the British attempt at Gallipoli during World War I, which ended in disaster for Allied power forces. So the fact that Mac had been against amphibious landings as a